Over the years, relations between America and Iran have seen their fair share of ups and downs. Dating back to the CIA and friends coercing a plan to overthrow Iran's prime minister back in 1953, it seems the relations between these two countries go back almost 70 years. And that's just what we know. In recent years, under Trump's presidency, it seems the two countries have had their relations significantly deteriorate, most notably following Trump's authorization of taking out Iran's top general, Qasem Soleimani, earlier this year. Iran vowed to take severe revenge as part of the retaliation, and although they've yet to do anything as significant as taking out a top general, many are fearing what the retaliation will include. With Biden now taking over in January, the world, Iran included, are hoping relations between the two countries improve. That being said, people aren't so sure Biden is going to handle his business much differently than Trump has, at least in regards to the two countries' relations. Today on Life's Biggest Questions, we're asking, what if Iran and America start World War III? Before we dive into it, be sure to give this video a thumbs up, as, I'd appreciate that. Now, as crazy of a year as 2020 has been, I'm happy that we never entered that third world war everyone was freaking out about back in January. But unfortunately, it's not like come 2021 everything restarts, the pandemic is over, and all world relations go back to square one. Unfortunately, life isn't a video game, but instead, a simulation. On a more serious note, given that in less than 2 months now, a new man is going to be leading the United States of America, if the country were to get involved in a third world war, it's unclear how the transition of power would work. Not to say it wouldn't happen at all, but things wouldn't be as seamless, say, as if the country wasn't in the middle of a world war. But it seems that would be the least of the concerns of the American people, as Iran is currently sitting on over 2,400 kilograms, which is more than 5,300 pounds, of enriched uranium. It's believed that's enough material to make at least 2 nuclear weapons if Iran were to decide to create them. As of now, they're saying their nuclear program is for peaceful purposes, but if a war was declared, well, they could change their tune real quick. First things first, let's look at why a third world war would break out in the first place. Aside from the assassination of one of their top generals, as recently as just a few weeks ago, Trump sent B-52 bombers, capable of nuclear power, to the Middle East as a warning to Iran and surrounding countries. Rumor has it Trump was talked out of a full-blown attack on the country, and instead sent this as a message which the US is hoping will, I quote, deter aggression and reassure US partners and allies. And speaking of allies, let's talk about who would side with who. Iran's key allies include neighboring or nearby countries such as Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, as well as numerous militia groups across the Middle East located in the previously named countries, as well as Yemen and the Gaza Strip. This includes Hezbollah in Lebanon as well, which is considered a terror group. Aside from this, a handful of countries would likely side with Iran, as they would have common enemies in both the United States and Israel. On the other side, the United States, who is a part of NATO, has their fair share of allies in the UK, France, Canada, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Australia, Mexico, Brazil, Kenya, of course Israel. I mean, the list goes on and on. With that being said, not all of these countries would necessarily want to get involved in a war, especially during a pandemic where millions have lost their lives and tens of thousands are still being infected on a daily basis. Still, some countries may not have a choice but to get involved, most notably Canada, the UK, and France, who are considered some of the country's bigger allies, as well as Israel, who would likely face their fair share of attacks from surrounding Middle Eastern countries should an all-out war break out. An interesting country to look at would be Russia, who, although Trump appears to have pretty decent relations with, may side with Iran, as the two countries are also quite buddy-buddy. But again, it's also quite possible some of the previously mentioned countries try to sit this one out altogether and only go to war when they have absolutely no other choice. The scary reality is, given how much enriched uranium Iran is sitting on, it is quite possible they have the capabilities to launch multiple nuclear weapons, which would likely cause a similar retaliation and eventually mass destruction of the world and the human race. But that's no fun. We can't just end the video there saying everyone starts nuking each other and we all go kaput. Now, we gotta make things a little more interesting, so let's talk about how things play out as the presidents deal with a world war while transitioning powers. As of this recording, President Trump's administration has started to brief the Biden team on numerous things, including the country's response to the pandemic and potentially some military-related info as well. If they were in the middle of a world war, you could be certain they'd be discussing the military. And this is where things could get a little tricky. Given that Trump is going to be out of office come January 20th, 2021, any move he does would then directly affect Biden, good or bad. For example, if he pulled an extreme move and threatened the Middle East with nuclear warfare or potentially attacked, Trump would only need to deal with repercussions, if any, until his last day in office. Biden would then be left to deal with issues started by Trump heading into his 4-year term. However, the opposite could be said as well, and appears to be the case, as President Trump has actually brokered a lot of peace deals in the Middle East, including improving relations between Israel and the UAE, as well as Sudan, which means it's quite possible that if a third world war were to break out, the previously mentioned countries in the UAE and Sudan may try to stay out of things, as they wouldn't want to go to war with the United States, nor would they want to regress the progression made in relation to their relationship with Israel. Now this leads into the next point of Israel being quite literally in the middle of everything. Given the Jewish state's close relationship with the United States, and its proximity in regards to the other countries which would be going to war with the US, which aside from Iran would include Syria and Lebanon as previously mentioned, it seems Israel could be where a lot of the war is fought, or at the very least, one of the first countries under attack. Placed in between the US and the aforementioned countries, and given that a war hasn't been fought on US soil in over 125 years, the idea that Israel continues to be a war zone seems to make the most sense. They deal with conflict on a regular basis as is, so it seems if a world war was going to break out involving countries in the Middle East, odds are that's where the majority of the fighting would take place. But given that the United States has multiple allies in the Middle East, which aside from Israel could include the UAE now, and potentially other countries such as Saudi Arabia, who sees the US as a strategic partner, it's really unclear which countries would join Iran in their quest to win the war. As previously mentioned, the ones who have a common enemy in either the US, Israel, or both would likely aid Iran. But it seems given the current state of affairs, countries would be much less likely or inclined to be part of any kind of war, let alone a world war. Unfortunately, as appears to be the case with most wars, and especially world wars, mass casualties are inevitable. If the previous two world wars are any indication of how many people would lose their lives, then it's safe to say the world's population would decrease by tens of millions when all was said and done. However, this is assuming the war drags on for years the way the first two world wars did. World War I had an estimated casualty rate of around 37 million, with that being on the higher end of estimates. World War II, again looking at the higher end of things, is believed to have taken the lives of approximately 56.4 million people when all was said and done. Now, if there's any indication of a pattern here, this means that World War III, again assuming the number of casualties is consistent with what happened in the previous two, could sit around 75 to 80 million casualties. Completely unnecessary losses of life. And this doesn't account for the pandemic, which would likely only worsen the situation with soldiers traveling overseas as they prepare for the war at hand. With the pandemic in mind, assuming the war causes it to spread even more and much faster than it currently is, the death toll could potentially even reach 100 million people between the actual war itself and the pandemic at hand. And it's possible that things get even worse, because dating back to World War I, which happened around the same time as the Spanish flu, well, aside from the 37+ million that lost their lives, the Spanish flu also killed another 50 million people alone. So you can imagine how bad things would be if we had a World War III during our current pandemic. Now again, these numbers really depend on how many countries get involved, what weapons are used, and how long the war goes on for. If the United States does what they did to Hiroshima and Nagasaki following the attack on Pearl Harbor, odds are the war wouldn't last very long, and there would be mass destruction in the Middle East. I don't see this being a plausible play, however, because once one country starts to fire off the nukes, it seems all bets are off. This gives Russia, North Korea, and any other country who is capable of causing similar damage the opportunity to flex their muscles and, well, attack whoever they want to either prove a point or to send a message to America and the rest of the world. This, to no surprise, would be a chain reaction, as not only would there be countless casualties, but the aftermath of the radiation would affect regions all over the world. Economies, natural resources, and entire countries would be absolutely destroyed, with just a memory left of what once was. Now this is obviously the absolute worst case scenario, which again, I think is very unlikely, but in a sense would appear to be the world pressing the reset button. The good news, at least as of this recording, is it seems cooler heads will prevail. Although President Trump seems to have an aggressive outlook when it comes to potential enemies in the Middle East, it seems those countries, such as Iran, are trying to just get by the next few weeks without any conflict in hopes that the new president improves relations. I'm not so sure that's going to be Biden's first or main priority, especially as we head into almost a year of the pandemic, but only time will tell. All in all, it's safe to say a third world war wouldn't really benefit anyone. So instead, let's hope the government continues working on those peace deals that Trump has been brokering the last 4 years. As always guys, let me know your thoughts on this one down below. For now, let's reply to some comments from the video. Would you survive Among Us in real life? Christian Banda said, me starts playing, that one player, red sus. Red's always sus. If you play the game, you know you never choose red. It's, you know, even if you're not it, people are gonna be like, it might have been red though, we don't know. So that's just a little tip, just don't do it. Nick Wool said, Life's Biggest Questions is looking a little sus right now. I'm not red though, I'm wearing white. So, and yellow. I'm yellow. If anything, guys, I'm yellow, obviously, look at me. Ryan the Vlogger said, Among Us would make a great movie. That actually would make a very good movie. Be like a cool like space movie with aliens breaking in and then the alien takes over. And, I don't know. Could be like a Disney movie, could be like a Lionsgate movie. Go either way, really. Anyways, guys, that's all for this one. I've been your host, Jared Bronstein. We'll see you in the next one.
Perfect. Alright, so make a stop to for that. Thank you.
Placed in between the US and the aforementioned countries. Placed in between the US and the aforementioned. How do you say it? Aforementioned? Aforementioned?
I say aforementioned.
Aforementioned?
I shall look it up.
Is that, I really, is it aforementioned? Aforementioned. So just a weird word that when you say it out loud, you're like, is that how you say it properly? Aforementioned.
Oh wait.